On the morning of June 6, 1989, more than 70 federal agents drove through the gate of a United States government facility carrying a search warrant. The agents came from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Environmental Protection Agency. The facility belonged to the Department of Energy. To get through the door without a confrontation, the first agents inside told plant managers they had come to deliver a briefing about a threat from an environmental extremist. That was not why they were there. It was the first time in American history that federal agents raided another federal agency, and the plant they raided, which had manufactured the plutonium cores of American nuclear weapons for 37 years, never returned to full production again. The place is called Rocky Flats. It sits on a windy plateau 16 miles northwest of downtown Denver, on the open ground between Golden and Boulder, with Arvada, Westminster, and Broomfield spreading out to the east and south. Over its working life, it produced roughly 70,000 plutonium triggers for the American nuclear arsenal. Today, you can park there and go for a walk. The buffer land around the old plant became the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge, and on September 15, 2018, it opened to the public with a little over 10 miles of trails. People hike there, people ride bicycles there, people walk their dogs there, elk graze on it. And in January of this year, after a fight over wording that ran for years and came down to arguments about individual adjectives, Boulder County and the city of Westminster finalized the language on new warning signs at the trail entrances. The signs carry a radiation symbol. They say that hiking or biking there may expose you to radioactive materials. They say that radioactive and hazardous materials remain in the soil and groundwater and may be present in airborne dust particles. Westminster's went up in late February. Somewhere inside that landscape, behind a fence the public will never cross, is a rectangle of ground called the 903 pad. Remember that name. The affidavit that got the FBI its warrant ran 116 pages, and its central accusation came out of 3 surveillance flights on freezing nights in December of 1988. That accusation was never proven. What replaced it was worse, and it came out of the company's own paperwork. To understand why a criminal investigation ended up pointed at a nuclear weapons plant, you have to go back to what the plant was for and to how little anyone outside it was ever told. The Atomic Energy Commission selected the Rocky Flats site in 1952. Dow Chemical ran it under contract until 1975. Rockwell International took over on the 30th of June that year and ran it until the raid. The work was the most sensitive in the American weapons complex. Rocky Flats machined plutonium into pits, the fissile cores at the heart of thermonuclear weapons. Nowhere else in the country did that job. At its peak, the plant employed thousands of people, and Colorado's economy depended on it. Machining plutonium is dangerous in a way that is easy to underestimate. Plutonium is pyrophoric. Fine shavings can ignite spontaneously in air. Rocky Flats did this work inside sealed glove boxes, and for the first 2 decades of its operation, the plant averaged around 10 fires a year. 2 of them mattered more than the rest. The first was on September 11, 1957, in Building 771. Plutonium ignited inside a glove box. The fire spread into the ventilation system and burned through the filters that were supposed to stop anything from leaving the stack. Contamination inside the building went past the range of the instruments then in use, which is how one damaged room ended up with an internal nickname among workers as the Infinity Room. Firefighters faced a choice between letting it burn and using water, which risked spreading contamination further. The fire took roughly half a day to control. Nobody outside the fence was told. Not the police, not the schools, not the county health department, not the ranchers whose cattle grazed downwind. Estimates of how much plutonium escaped that day still vary by more than an order of magnitude depending on whose reconstruction you read, and that disagreement has never been resolved. The second fire was on Mother's Day, May 11, 1969. and it started in a glove box in Building 776 before spreading through the conveyor line into Building 777. These were the primary plutonium production buildings. Smoke was thick enough that firefighters navigated by exit lines painted on the floor. The heat was severe enough that the roof began to deform. It became the costliest industrial fire in the United States up to that point. And in a detail that shapes everything afterward, the fire destroyed the building's own filters and its own monitoring equipment, which means the total release from that day cannot be measured. It can only be estimated backward. But neither fire is the part of this story that has left the deepest mark on the ground. That part involves barrels. Machining plutonium requires cutting oil to keep the lathes from binding. The oil became contaminated with plutonium fines and with solvents including carbon tetrachloride. The plant could not find a satisfactory way to process the spent oil, so from July of 1958, it poured the waste into 50 5-gallon steel drums and stacked them outdoors, in an open field on the eastern side of the site. The Department of Energy's own site history puts the count at 3,570 drums. Other accounts put it above 5,000. Steel drums holding oil and chlorinated solvents sitting on bare ground through Colorado winters year after year. They corroded. According to the site's own chronology, leakage occurred between 1964 and 1967. The last drums were hauled away on June 5, 1968. And that is when the actual problem started, because removing the barrels exposed the contaminated soil that had been sitting underneath them on an exposed plateau where winter gusts have been recorded above 100 miles per hour. The soil went into the air, and it went east. The area was capped with gravel and then asphalt in 1969, which is roughly a decade after the drums first arrived. For years, the assumption outside the fence was that whatever contamination existed came from the Mother's Day fire, because the fire was visible, and the barrels were not. That assumption turned out to be wrong, and what proved it wrong is the strongest piece of evidence in this entire story, because it did not come from one source. It came from three, and all three had reasons to disagree with each other. Edward Martell was a radiochemist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, who had worked on Pacific weapons testing after the war. Alarmed by the 1969 fire, he went out with a colleague and collected soil himself. He measured background in Loveland, well away from the plant, and then measured near the site boundary. On January 13, 1970, he wrote to Glenn Seaborg, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, reporting plutonium in soil at Indiana Street and Woman Creek, running hundreds of times above background. Then he held a press conference, and the public knew for the first time. The Atomic Energy Commission did not simply deny it, it sent its own scientists. P.W. Cray and E.P. Hardy came out from the Commission's Health and Safety Laboratory and produced report AHASL 235 in 1970, which confirmed elevated plutonium east of Indiana Street and produced a contamination map that circulated widely for decades afterward. And Dow Chemical, the company being accused, convened its own internal committee under Robert Seed, which reported in 1971. A hostile outside critic, the federal regulator, and the accused contractor all sampled the same ground independently, and all found the same thing. In a 1972 paper, Martell and a colleague reported that plutonium and americium levels just east of the plant boundary ran up to hundreds of times what nuclear weapons testing fallout would explain, and that even in more densely populated parts of Denver, The surface soil concentration sat several times above fallout levels. Faced with that, the Atomic Energy Commission eventually conceded the point it had resisted. The off-site soil contamination was not mainly from the fire everyone had seen. The likelier sources were the 1957 fire nobody had been told about, and the field of leaking drums. Which brings us to a criminal case. By 1987, workers inside the plant had begun talking to the Environmental Protection Agency and the FBI, and the agent who took the case was named John Lipsky. To understand what the FBI thought it had, and what it actually had, you have to understand what plutonium contamination physically is at a place like this, because almost every argument since 1989 has turned on that one technical point. This is not a liquid seeping through bedrock. It is particulate, plutonium dioxide bound onto grains of soil, lifted by wind, carried on the prevailing westerlies off the mountains, and deposited to the east and southeast. Alongside it, you find americium-241, which forms as plutonium-241 decays, and which is useful because its ratio to the plutonium acts as a fingerprint, distinguishing material that came off this site from the global fallout that atmospheric weapons testing spread across the entire planet. Alpha radiation from these particles cannot get through skin. It cannot get through a sheet of paper. The pathway that matters, the only one that seriously matters, is inhalation. A particle that reaches lung tissue and stays there delivers its energy into a very small volume of cells, continuously, for as long as it remains. The 903 pad is where that entire mechanism was assembled by accident. Oil, then drums, then corrosion, then bare soil, then wind in that order, with nobody at any stage deciding to release anything. A study published in Health Physics in 1996, sponsored by the Colorado Department of Health as part of a formal dose reconstruction, modeled the release using environmental data from the 1960s and 70s and estimated that the total plutonium carried beyond plant-owned property from that one location came to roughly 7 curies. The highest predicted off-site dose to a member of the public came out in the single-digit millirem range. Contemporary monitoring recorded the highest airborne concentration at a monitor about 100 meters east of the pad, directly in the prevailing wind direction. Those are the numbers, and they are contested at the margins, and they are still the best reconstruction anyone has produced. Now, the investigation. Insiders at the plant, including an engineer named Jim Stone, told investigators that plutonium-contaminated waste was being incinerated at night in Building 771 in a unit that had been ordered shut down. Lipsky's team reasoned that if something was burning, it would be hot, and heat can be photographed. On the nights of December 9th, 10th, and 15th, 1988, an FBI aircraft carrying forward-looking infrared equipment flew over the plant. The affidavit built on that evidence was unsealed on June 9, 1989 by a federal magistrate after a legal challenge from the Rocky Mountain News. It alleged environmental violations reaching back to November of 1980. It alleged illegal night incineration. It alleged discharges into creeks that fed drinking water reservoirs for communities including Broomfield and Westminster. It stated there was probable cause to believe that Rockwell and Department of Energy officials had falsely certified that Rocky Flats was in compliance with the law. And it quoted a 1986 internal Department of Energy memo warning senior officials that some waste practices at the plant were, in the memo's own word, illegal, and that misleading departmental statements had kept the public from understanding how bad the site really was. Colorado's governor, Roy Romer, learned about all of this the same way everyone else did, by reading it in the newspaper, and said publicly that it was inexcusable that the information had been withheld from the people of Colorado. Here is where an honest account has to slow down, because the most dramatic allegation in this story is the one that did not survive. The night incineration charge was never substantiated. Romer later described in public remarks going out to look at the incinerator himself. He said it was roughly the size of a refrigerator, that he was told it took around 30 people to operate, and that he did not believe it had been burning. He said that years afterward, the FBI told him the film had been faulty. The heat signature the aerial camera picked up had other plausible explanations. Not one of the original charges that triggered the raid was proven. What was proven came from documents. On March 26, 1992, Rockwell International agreed to plead guilty to 10 federal environmental crimes, 5 felonies, and 5 misdemeanors under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act and the Clean Water Act, and to pay $18.5 million. The district court accepted the plea on June 1, 1992. It was the largest fine for an environmental crime to that date, 4 times the previous record. It was also, according to the General Accounting Office, less than the performance bonuses the Department of Energy had paid Rockwell for running the plant. And it named no individuals at all. That last detail matters because a grand jury had already decided otherwise. Colorado's first ever special grand jury was impaneled on August 1, 1989. It sat for more than 2.5 years, heard from over 100 witnesses, and worked through hundreds of boxes of evidence. On May 18, 1991, it voted to indict 8 individuals, some from Rockwell and some from the Department of Energy. Not one of those indictments was ever signed by a prosecutor. The jurors were discharged on March 24, 1992, 2 days before the plea deal was announced. They then wrote their own report describing what they had seen and asked the court to release it. On September 25, 1992, Judge Sherman Fine Silver ordered it sealed. A redacted version was permitted out in January of 1993. Nobody outside a federal courtroom has ever lawfully read all of it, all of which leaves an ordinary person with a practical problem, because roughly 3 million people live in the Denver metro area, and a growing number of them are being handed a trail map to this place. So here is how to check any of it for yourself, and it is not difficult. Start with the geography, because almost everyone gets this wrong in one direction or the other. There are 2 different pieces of land here with 2 different owners. The refuge is about 5,200 acres of former buffer zone, transferred to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, open to the public, with a little over 10 miles of trails. And as of last summer, new access points including a bridge over Indiana Street and an underpass at Colorado 128. Inside that refuge sits a separate rectangle of roughly 1,300 acres called the Central Operable Unit, still owned by the Department of Energy Office of Legacy Management, permanently closed, where groundwater treatment systems still run and 2 closed landfills are still maintained. Locals call it the Donut Hole. It is where the 800 building stood, where more than 10,000 people once worked every day, and where some structures were judged so contaminated that burying them was safer than breaking them up and hauling them out. If someone tells you the plant site is open to the public, they are wrong. If someone tells you the ground people walk on has nothing to do with the plant, they are also wrong. The 903 pad sits inside that closed rectangle near its eastern edge. The wind ran east, which means the line on the map between the closed land and the open land is not a line the contamination ever respected. And that single fact is the root of every argument that has happened since. Then learn 1 unit and 1 number. The unit is picocuries per gram. The site cleanup standard is 50 picocuries per gram. Most soil samples from the refuge come back around 1. The follow-up samples taken after the scare of 2019 came back under 3. The Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment modeled a visitor dose on the assumption of 100 visits a year at 2.5 hours per visit, which is more than most people will ever manage, and calculated roughly 0.3 of a millirem per year for an adult and 0.2 for a child. On those assumptions, an adult would need decades of refuge visits to accumulate the dose of a single medical CT scan. Then go to the primary sources, which are public and free. The Department of Energy Office of Legacy Management runs a public document search that hosts the plant's own internal chronology, the one that records the drum counts and the leak dates. The Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment maintains a Rocky Flats page that hosts the 2019 Geographic Information System soil sample map, where you can look up individual sample locations and readings instead of reading someone's summary of them, along with the Colorado State University review of that sampling, the dose assessment summary, and the 5th 5-year review of the Superfund site from July of 2022. And then the mistake. The one that quietly ruins almost every public argument about this place. Nearly all of it is conducted using averages. Average picocuries per gram, average dose, average risk. An average is the wrong instrument for what is actually in that soil. Because the plutonium at Rocky Flats exists in 2 forms, and the difference between them is the whole fight. The first form is dispersed, spread thinly and fairly evenly across the surfaces of soil particles. That is what decades of standard sampling measured, and it is what the official dose models were built around. The second form is discrete grains of essentially pure plutonium dioxide, physically separate specks sitting in the dirt. These are called hot particles, and they do not behave like an average at all. The clearest demonstration of that is on the public record, and it happened in August of 2019. During soil sampling for the proposed Jefferson Parkway toll road along Indiana Street, one sample came back at 264 picocuries per gram. The cleanup standard is 50, a different portion of the same sample measured 1.5. Both results were correct. The sample simply was not uniform. A single particle had landed in one subsample and not the other. 25 additional samples requested afterward all came back below 3. Follow-up analysis, published through Physicians for Social Responsibility Colorado and led by Michael Ketterer, used methods designed specifically to find the particles rather than the average. Working on surface soil from the county right-of-way west of Indiana Street, near the old east gate of the plant, that work identified 46 individual plutonium dioxide particles, ranging from 0.4 of a micron to just over 2 microns across. That size range is respirable. Particles that small can reach lung tissue and stay there. The counterargument deserves to be stated just as clearly, because it is made by people who have read the same data. Friends of the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge argue that these particles contribute less than half a picocurie per gram to total soil content, that they are already folded into the dose estimates, that the single, very large particle emerged from many hundreds of samples, and that the modeled additional cancer risk from inhaling a large number of them is on the order of 1%. Colorado State Public Health Medical Director Ned Kalange has said that review after review shows no additional radiation risk to people recreating in the refuge. The health record is where this gets genuinely unresolved. The state's cancer registry study from 1998 and its update covering 1990 through 2014 found no overall elevated cancer incidence in the 10 communities around the site compared with the rest of metropolitan Denver. The state's own environmental epidemiologist acknowledged that the study cannot answer the exposure question because it captures people who were living in the area when they were diagnosed and cannot follow the ones who moved away. A self-reported survey run by Metropolitan State University of Denver, together with the Rocky Flats Downwinders, with 1,745 participants, found thyroid cancer showing up as the second most commonly reported cancer, against a national ranking of 9th and roughly 40% of reported cancers classified as rare. Its own lead investigator said it was not statistically rigorous and that it was too early to draw a link. Both sides agree on what is missing: per-person exposure reconstruction, which was never done and which, after 70 years, probably can no longer be done. And there is one more thing. In July of 2019, when a coalition of community groups petitioned the federal court to unseal the grand jury's business records, the Department of Justice and the United States Attorney's Office in Denver reported that they could not locate them. 60 to 65 sealed boxes, not in the office and not at the Federal Records Center where closed cases are stored. So consider what the thumbnail claim actually means. The lying is not the mysterious part. The lying is documented, admitted, and adjudicated in open court. A 1986 departmental memo said the public had been kept from understanding how bad the site was. Rockwell pleaded guilty to false certifications of compliance. Dow and Rockwell later paid $375 million to settle a class action brought by property owners downwind, a case filed in 1990 and not finally approved until 2017, with the class defined as everyone who owned property in the affected area on June 7, 1989, the day after the raid. That settlement compensated for property values. It compensated for no health effects at all, because no link was ever established. What remains unknown is a separate question from what was lied about, and collapsing the two together is how this story gets wrecked in both directions at once. The scandal at Rocky Flats was never that the ground is definitely dangerous. It is that after 37 years of production, $7 billion of cleanup, a federal criminal case, and half a century of sampling, nobody can tell you with real confidence how dangerous it is or is not. And the boxes that might have narrowed the question cannot be found. Which is why the image people remember, 70 federal agents walking into a federal facility with a warrant, is the wrong way to end this. It feels like the moment the truth came out. It was not. The headline allegation collapsed. The indictments were never signed. The report was sealed. Production stopped. The mission changed to cleanup. The buildings came down, and the question got handed forward to everyone who came afterward without the evidence file attached. The 903 pad is now a remediated rectangle inside a fence that no member of the public will ever cross. It has been capped, excavated, sampled, modeled, and reviewed. It is also still the reason a sign exists. So here is the small thing, and it is genuinely small. The next time you are at one of those trailheads, on the north side where Boulder County's signs already stand, or at the Westminster entrances where they went up in late February, read the sign all the way to the end. Not the headline with the radiation symbol, the rest of it. The sentence about airborne dust particles. The sentence noting that some nearby communities and some industry professionals continue to raise concerns about the area's safety. Every clause in those few sentences was fought over, word by word, by people who had actually read the documents. And the word some was added at the last minute because even the disagreement had to be described accurately. Then decide for yourself and walk or do not. That sign is the most honest thing anyone has ever put up at Rocky Flats. And it took 37 years of production, one raid, and 34 years of argument to get it written.